Now that we're done with control flow, let's move to the next major topic, which is going to be functions. We're going to divide this into two major sections. The first will explore exactly what functions are to begin with, and then how to implement and call upon functions to run or execute them. And then the next section will be how to pass in parameters and use them, and also how to take out return values and use those. So let's head on over to main activity. Again, we're kind of starting from a clean slate. I just moved all of the text to our control flow texts. So to start off with, what exactly are functions and how do we use them in Kotlin? Well, functions are the parts of the code that actually do something, okay? So they contain a statement or a block of statements, and when we call upon the function, we basically execute or run those statements. However, until we call upon that function, we can essentially consider that code hidden away so that it's not going to be executed again until we call it. Now this is very, very useful to us because we don't necessarily want to execute every line of code every single time. We want finer control over exactly when and where we execute certain statements. Also, it allows us to just keep our code a bit more organized by grouping together related statements with very similar functionality. In fact, everything that we've been writing so far has existed within a function whether or not we realized it. You see, it will ignore the override for now, but it's declared with the fun keyword. We have the name. In the brackets beside it, we have any parameters. Sometimes we'll have no parameters, sometimes we'll have lots of parameters. And then within these curly braces, we have the actual code we want to execute when this function is called. Now, the onCreate function is a very special kind of function, and is essentially just called when this activity loads up and is a way to just kind of provide a bit of setup for that particular screen. Incidentally, it is calling a bunch of functions itself, but we don't need to worry about that so much. It's a bit more advanced, this particular one. We'll be studying something a little more simple. So actually, let's launch right into an example. Consider the case where maybe we're building like a video game or something, and we want some kind of a function to dictate the player movement. So we want this player to be able to move forwards or backwards. Let's ignore up or down for now. And so there's a few ways in which we can do this. Probably we'll keep track of the player's position somehow in a variable, and then we'll just increase this or decrease this by a certain amount. Okay, this is pretty easy to do if we just say, for example, player position +1, player position -1, but it would make a little more sense to put this in a function because there might be other functionality associated with it. So let's create a function to help us do this. By the way, functions within classes are actually called methods, but we haven't really talked about classes yet, so let's just refer to them as functions. So again, we're going to set up with a fun. Okay, we're not going to worry about override or any kind of access modifiers, and then we'll provide a name. In this case, let's call this something like move. Okay, in the brackets beside it, we're not going to worry about parameters yet, so let's leave that blank. And then we'll put the curly braces, and then any code will be written in here. So if there is no explicit return type, as is the case here, the return type is a unit, but we don't really worry about that. We just generally leave it blank unless we want to return something else. Okay, so we'll put in here the actual function body or the code we want to execute when this is called upon. So let's say we have a player position variable. Okay, this is just going to be an int. Let's keep things simple. And we're going to set this equal to 5 to start off with. So what we want to do is maybe just increase or decrease the player position by a certain amount. So we're just going to say player position plus equals some amount, let's say 2. Okay, so what will happen is every time this function is called upon, it's going to execute these statements in here. The way in which we call upon the function is simply by providing its name and then the brackets beside it, and then passing in any parameters. Note that if we want to call on a function, it actually has to be called from within another function, which is a little counterintuitive, but that's just the way that these programs work. So in Android Studio, when you're building Android apps, pretty much any activity that you start, this is going to be your main function, so you'll want to call all of your setup functions from within here. And then also you might want to trigger extra functionality when the user interacts with UI elements such as button presses, edits texts, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I could call the function here. What I couldn't do is call the function somewhere else that's outside of the function itself, so it gives me an error. Okay, so this is all right. What this is doing is it's going to load the page. It's going to call on this function move. This is going to create a variable called player position, and it's going to increase it by 2. Okay, all right, that's fine, it works, but it's actually not a very useful function at all. The reason being that this variable player position only exists within this scope here. So this means because it's created within these curly braces, Once this function finishes executing, it's as if player position never existed at all. Okay? This is called a local variable because it only exists within the scope of this particular function. Anything that's created within these curly braces only exists within these curly braces. So even though we're increasing player position by 2, it's as if, after we've finished calling this, it's as if player position never existed. The way in which we'd want to keep track of a player position is by creating what's called a global variable. So we'd want to say variable player position up top. We're going to give it a type int, and I'm just going to initialize it to be 0. This would be a best way of doing things, because then I could do this, and it's going to keep track of my actual player position. Every time I update it, adding it by 2, it's going to keep track of that, okay? So this is called a global variable, which means it's accessed everywhere within this class, okay? Everywhere within these curly braces. Again, variables are accessed within the curly braces in which they're declared. So in this case now, every time I call move, let's say I called it again, and again, by this point, my player position is now going to be equal to 6. Now it's 8, now it's 10, and so on and so forth, okay? So essentially, if you want to keep track of a variable's value, you generally declare it as global. If you only need that variable to exist temporarily, then you'll probably want to declare it as local within the function scope. Now this is a little better than the original move function that we created because it's now taking into account the actual state that exists already, but it still isn't that great. The reason being we're increasing this position by 2 every single time, but what if we want to move backwards? There's no function for that. And what if we want to move forwards by more than 2 or less than 2? Again, we're not really taking that into account. So we could create a separate move function for every different positional change possible, but that's essentially an infinite number of changes, so it's better to use parameters so that we can pass values in. However, I'd like to save parameters and return values for the next topic. All I wanted to do here is provide a basic intro into functions. Also, you might be asking, this only has one line of code in which we're increasing player position by 2. Why don't we just do this? Okay, whoops, didn't mean that slash. And this, and then keep doing this. Well, this is fine for this case scenario, but what if our function was actually more complex? What if this function had 10 lines of code? Do we really want to have to write those 10 lines of code every single time we want to call upon that? Well, it's actually better just to write the 10 lines once, and then call upon the function so that we don't have to repeat those lines of code. Alright, so that's a basic intro into functions. We know how to implement them, basically give them functionality, and then call upon them to run that functionality. We talked about global versus local variables. So what I'd recommend you do is play around with this stuff a little bit, maybe create some functions of your own, play around with global versus local variables. And once you're ready to move on, we'll spice things up by adding in parameters and return values.